Perfect. Okay, well, yeah, thank you so much for inviting me here to speak to you all. As I was introduced, I'm now at the Museum für Naturkunde in Berlin, but most of the work that I'm going to be talking about today was done during my PhD at the University of Bristol in the UK. And what I'm going to be talking to you today about is a little bit strange, but it's essentially all the ways that we think that maybe electricity, and in particular naturally occurring electricity, could play an ecological role in the natural lives of many different animals and plants and other organisms. If we can have the next slide, please. Some of this will be very boring to some of you. It'll be old news, but I think it is worth just quickly running through what I mean by some of the words that I'm going to be using today. So we'll do a little bit of physics revision for you all. So when I talk about charges and electric fields, what I'm really saying is that with any electrically charged object, this is something that either has too many or too few electrons or protons. These are going to emit electric fields, and these electric fields can exert a force on other charged objects. If you have two of the same polarity, so positive and positive, they will repel. But if you have the opposite polarity, they'll be attractive to each other. Now, the reason that we're kind of all here today is that we know that many living things are going to have an excess or a deficiency of electrons or protons. And what that means is that most living things are going to be sources of electric field. If we can have the next slide, please. And so what I set out to do back in 2022 was essentially review what we know about how these naturally occurring electric fields that are coming from living organisms or from the natural environment could play an ecological role for these animals. How might they be using these electric fields to their benefit? And that ended up in this publication that's available to read in Biological Reviews. And I'm just going to run you through the quick summary of the main findings of this study. If we can have the next slide, please. So one of the main findings, and one of the primary ones that we came to, was that indeed many animals accumulate significant electrostatic charges as they naturally go about their lives flying through the air or walking across surfaces. If we have the next slide, please. Next slide, please, if that's okay. Now, there's obviously potentially ecological consequences for this because it means that animals and other organisms can interact electrically. And one primary manifestation of this is electroreception, the ability of an animal to detect ecologically relevant electric fields. And again, we find that this sense is very widespread, mostly known from the aquatic environment. But recently, more evidence is coming to light about it being used in the terrestrial environment too, for example, by bumblebees, spiders, and other insects. But one of the alarming things that we realized when we surveyed the literature is that actually a lot of the electrosensitivity thresholds for these species are sensitive enough that many anthropogenic sources of electricity, for example, from subsea power cables or overhead power cables in the terrestrial environment, are within those detection thresholds. So it's possible that anthropogenic sources of electric fields may be interfering with the electric sense of many organisms. If we can have the next slide, please. But overall, kind of the main finding of our review is actually very little is known about how these electric fields, anthropogenic or not, are being used in the natural lives of these animals. And so what I'm going to quickly run you through, I'm going to give you a very quick whistle-stop tour of some of the work that I've actually done since this paper to try and fix this problem. If we can have the next slide, please. And we're going to look at three of the main, kind of most important, really, ecological interactions, that at least that I could think of, which are pollination, parasitism, and predator-prey interactions. If we can have the next slide. So to begin with pollination, and if we go to the next slide. So what I did for this study was I looked and I tried to measure the electrostatic charge that's accumulated by various species of butterfly and moth that have very different ecologies. Some of them will be diurnal, nocturnal, some of them visit flowers, some of them don't, some of them are tropical, some of them are temperate, to try and get an idea of how these animals might or might not build up static charge as they fly through the air. And what we find is that basically all of these species do naturally accumulate fairly significant static charges as they're flying around. If we can have the next slide, please. And the ecological consequence of this is that as a butterfly or a moth approaches a flower, a very strong electric field is formed in the order of kilovolts per meter. And what this means is that pollen that's situated on the flower can actually be transferred from the sexual organs of the flower onto the butterfly without any contact even being made. The pollen can just jump across, which of course increases the pollination efficiency for these flowers, which is beneficial for them. If we can have the next slide, please. So moving on to parasitism. For this, if we go to the next slide, please. We looked at ticks, parasitic ticks that are, have huge financial, economic, social consequences with humans because they cause diseases like Lyme's disease and encephalitis with us, but also within our livestock too. We first started out by trying to figure out, well, can typical hosts of ticks carry electrostatic charge too? As an example here, I presented the electric field of a cow, but the same principle applies to things like rabbits, dogs, but also humans that are wearing clothing especially. But we find that, again, these are sources of electric field. And if we go to the next slide, and if you go again, just because there's a video that should play with this, hopefully it'll play. Yeah, so the frame rate is a bit low on the thing, but you can see that basically if you expose a tick to a comparable electric field, that what you would find coming from a host like a cow or a rabbit or a human, that they can actually be electrostatically pulled across the air gap, which increases the efficiency of these ticks in finding their hosts. And so we'll talk about this hopefully more in the discussion, but there's definitely room for some kind of mitigation for this strategy of the ticks that could maybe prevent infestations in the future. If we go to the next slide, please. So to finish off, we're going to talk about probably the most important ecological interaction, just because it's so ubiquitous and also fatal to many animals, and that's predator-prey interactions. So if we go to the next slide, please. So again, kind of following a similar strategy, we measured the charge on a predatory wasp, Vespula vulgaris, and 3 species of caterpillar that it predates upon. We find that all of these species, again, carry some kind of electric charge just from living their natural lives. And again, the consequence of this is that a strong electric field is formed between a wasp and a caterpillar as they interact with each other in nature. If we go to the next slide, please. And so what I wanted to see was whether these caterpillars can actually detect the approaching electric field of a wasp. Mm-hmm. So I presented them with wasp mimicking electric fields. And we find that all 3 species react defensively, either by coiling, by trying to bite the electric field source, or flailing around. Next slide, please. And even more interestingly, we managed to actually elucidate the mechanism for this. So we showed that mechanosensory hairs that these caterpillars have for sensing sound, but also touch, can actually also be deflected by electric fields, and they're able to sense this. Now, really interestingly is that they actually have quite a specific electromechanical resonance around 180 hertz, which just so happens to be the wing beat frequency of many of their predators. But somewhat alarmingly, we also see that there is still sensitivity around 50 or 60 hertz, which of course is mains electricity. So it means that there is a potential here that anthropogenic noise from power lines could be interfering with this sensory system in caterpillars. And if we have the next slide, please. But yeah, I just wanted to give you kind of a quick summary, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss in more detail another time. And yeah, just thank you very much to my funders and the institutions that helped with this work. Thank you very much.